Welcome to the Northern Myths podcast, where we explore the myths and legends of Northern Europe from an archetypal perspective. I'm Dan Larrabee.
And I'm Luke the Wolf.
Welcome to our episode of the Northern Myths podcast. Today we'll be looking at the myth of the Tale of Rig, or Rígsþula. I think I pronounced that right. Kind of. I missed an S in there. I'm terrible with these other languages that aren't English. Even English a little. But so it's Tale of Rig. It's a pretty well-known tale. It's Heimdall in the guise of Rig going around sort of meeting different couples and setting up society. There's some weird stuff in it for sure, and we'll definitely get into it. How are you doing today, Luke?
I'm good, Dan. How are you?
I'm pretty good. I'm pretty excited about getting into this one. I think this is one of the first myths I ever read just on my own. Because one, it's fairly popular and fairly straightforward in what goes on there. But so I'm excited to take a deep dive into it.
Definitely. The content of this poem was definitely one of the big draws for me. I was similar in terms of knowing this poem for quite a long time and being into it. It's one of the more interesting poems symbolically as well. Although what goes on in the poem is fairly straightforward, what it represents and means, there's quite a few layers, so it's going to be fairly interesting. It's longer than the last one we did, which was Baldur's Dreams. That one was extremely short, but this one is a little more medium length, but also a little bit more narrative as well. So we'll definitely get into a little bit more of the story with this one. A couple of other names for this poem as well, not only just the Tale of Rig, but literally Rígsþula means Rig's list, which is sort of interesting. I think we'll get into why that is the case in the poem. And the Lay of Rig is usually what this is translated as in terms of the common name for this, but Dr. Jackson Crawford has chosen the Tale of Rig as the way he translates this. And the Lay of Rig would also be Rigsmal, as in the same word as Havamal, except Rigsmal, and that's how you get Lay of Rig for that. So just a little bit of introduction there. And of course, we have to mention that we're happy to mention that we are using Dr. Jackson Crawford's Poetic Edda. So thanks to him and to Hackett Publishing for letting us use it. We love this translation. It's definitely very readable, very modern, but also maintains the spirit and the meaning quite well. We've spoken with Dr. Crawford ourselves, and we're just happy to get to use it. There's also an audiobook version of the Poetic Edda read by Dr. Crawford, and he's just got the voice for it. He pronounces everything correctly, and it's a great companion. If you enjoy our show, check out the audiobook because it's very, very well done.
Absolutely. It's a great audiobook. I love it. I definitely sometimes I'll actually listen to it while I'm reading the my copy of the Poetic Edda, just to get the full immersion of it.
Exactly. And so thank you again to Dr. Crawford. And is there anything else you wanted to do for the introduction of the poem?
No, I think we can dive into the poem after some housekeeping.
Exactly. So on that note, we are sponsored by Grimfrost, our favorite source of Norse and Viking products. We're actually sporting a couple of their great t-shirts right now. If you're on YouTube, you can take a look. If you're just listening, feel free to head over to YouTube and take a look at what we've got. We've got a couple of new designs of theirs. I'm wearing this Loki mask design, and Dan is wearing Thor mask design, and these are premium quality, very good fabric sort of thing. This is some great stuff. We're big fans of their work, and we have been even before starting the show. I've even got some t-shirts of theirs that I've been wearing in previous episodes already. So yeah, there's that. We're just big fans of theirs to begin with, so we're just happy to be able to tell you about them. They are based in Sweden with a vast selection of historical Viking reproductions as well as contemporary products inspired by Viking Age culture. They make all this stuff in-house, all these reproductions. They're fantastic quality, really awesome. And their contemporary products, again, like these t-shirts and things, they got great designs, lots of really awesome products, and a lot of other cool things too, like drinking horns, beard care products, gym wear, whole tons of stuff. Like they got lots and lots. Just check out their website, grimfrost.com, if you want to see everything that they've got available.
I saw that they had these little statuettes of the gods that were like based on archaeological finds. I thought that was really cool. Like definitely worth checking out. I also like that our shirts. This wasn't done on purpose, I don't think, but you've got the Loki mask, I've got the Thor mask. It's like chaos and order, and then we're coming together and making this divine child of a podcast. It's couldn't get any better.
No, definitely not. So big thank you to Grimfrost for sending these over. They're excellent shirts, and yeah, hopefully you check them out. And just like our show, they aim to build a bridge between the past and the present, bringing relevant parts of Old Norse culture into today's world. And that's really just why we're thrilled to be able to tell you about them, because they are absolutely the brand for this stuff that we have been big fans of for a long time, and that really just fits with the theme of the show. So again, check them out, grimfrost.com. And of course, the other way that you can support the show is our Patreon. So we're at patreon.com/Northern Myths. And if you want to support the show, every little bit helps. You can do so there. We've got quite a few things for our patrons, including early access to episodes. That's a big one. Basically, as soon as I'm done editing the episodes, we upload it to Patreon there. And we also try and make it kind of a little bit of a blog thing, updates to the show behind the scenes, what we're working on before we make it a little more public. So that's one way that you can get in touch with us and be a little more in touch with the show for sure. And we've got plans for expanding what we do with the Patreon. Of course, that's just what we launched with, but we have ideas and we're open to suggestions about how to make that even better. And of course, everything we do with the Patreon goes to supporting the show. We're looking towards getting some major upgrades to our equipment that's going to make the podcast much better, and just make sure that we maintain the quality and have good backups of all our recordings, because we ran into a couple of issues that have been hard to work around. And of course, some new equipment is one of the best ways to do that. Some new software as well is what we're looking at too. A whole bunch of things. We got a long list, but every little bit of support helps and goes towards that. So that's the best way you can support the show, patreon.com/Northern Myths. And there are, of course, a couple of other ways you can support the show as well. We've got a merchandise store where you can get Northern Myths podcast branded shirts and mugs and things like that. We've also got an Amazon affiliate program where we have a whole bunch of recommended books and music and things like that. That's on our website, northernmyths.com. And if you want to get a hold of us, you can do so on social media. We're on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, either Northern Myths or Northern Myths Podcast on all platforms. We are on Twitter personally at NorthMythLuke and at NorthMythDan. And we are also on YouTube, which is a great place if you want to comment on the individual episodes there. That's a great place to do that, have discussions. And if you're not on any of those social media platforms, you can also reach us at our email, northernmythspodcast@gmail.com. All of this info will be below in the description. And I think that's pretty well it. We'll probably recap all that at the end of the episode, but I think for now, that's all the ways that you can support the show and get in touch with us. And of course, Grimfrost, check them out. They're awesome.
They are awesome. Yeah, I love them, and they're doing exactly what we're trying to do, right? So it's, yeah, we couldn't be happier. We just couldn't be happier. All right, shall we dive into Rígsþula?
Let's do it.
All right, so this will be the introduction to stanza 3. Back to the poem. Men say in old sagas that one of the Aesir, the god named Heimdall, went on a journey along a certain seashore, and soon he came to a farm where he gave his name as Rig. This poem is about that story. It is said that a wise god, Rig, powerful and aged, fierce and strong, walked upon green roads. In the middle of the road he came walking. He came to a house. The door was open. He went in. A fire burned on the floor, and a gray-haired couple sat before it, named I and Edda. They were an aged pair. Rig knew how to give them good counsel. He sat down between them, with the man and the woman on either side of him. Luke, what do you think that means?
Well, Dan, this is definitely a great introduction to the poem, and it makes explicit that the character is Heimdall here, who is the hypostasy of Rig, Rig being one of his names, essentially. And we've seen Heimdall a couple other places before. Actually, Heimdall is the first character mentioned in the Voluspa. So that first stanza is essentially the first place where we meet Heimdall, who is the guardian of Asgard. And the thing about that first stanza in the Voluspa is it says, it references all the children of Heimdall, referring to men. That is referring to this poem, Rígsþula. And the importance of that story is really emphasized by it being in Voluspa, because it's essentially so historically well known that they included it in this most famous poem of theirs, the Voluspa, which tells the story of the creation of the world all the way through to its destruction at Ragnarok. And the couple of other ways we've seen Heimdall act have been elsewhere in the Voluspa. We hear that he is essentially the guardian of the Rainbow Bridge, which is the link between Asgard and Midgard. And that really puts his role as being something like a guardian or a protector or a warden of boundaries, things like that. And he also is the one who is the keeper of the Jarl horn, which is the horn that's going to sound when Ragnarok takes place. All of these things together just mean that Rig is kind of Rig as Heimdall and Heimdall as Rig is this character that cares about boundaries and structure and the walls around the important places, things like that. The things that are put in place to keep precious things safe from the chaos of the outside world. That is, in a lot of ways, what Heimdall, being the guardian of Asgard, really represents and means. And now here we're seeing Heimdall wandering out on green roads. He's going out into the unknown, but not so unknown. We've got roads. So he's out here wandering, presumably among men, right? Among humans in Midgard. And we'll get back to Heimdall and Rig as the boundary keeper, because what we're going to discuss here in terms of the implications for social hierarchy is essentially all based on that role of Heimdall as this guardian of boundaries, of structure. Now, before digging into this much further, I just want to point out that it's interesting and descriptive where he first finds himself. He finds himself with I, as in spelled AI, and Edda. And those names just mean great-grandfather and great-grandmother. And the implication of that for me is that this is age, that this implies the age of these characters. In fact, they say it's a gray-haired couple. They're in a house with an open door, a fire on the floor. Just this initial picture is something like, it's not necessarily all that well off. And not to spoil this too much further, because we are going to get into some more detail that's going to be good to flesh out what these characters are about. But just kind of starting off here, Rig is getting involved with what I see on the initial look is kind of the precursor to modern civilization. And I'll have more to say about that, but Dan, what do you think?
Well, one, I definitely agree with you that it's sort of a precursor to civilization. It's sort of like they've got roads, but they're also, the fire is burning on the floor. It's not in a hearth. It's not in like an actual fireplace. It's sort of the very beginning of like agriculture and like setting up like a sedentary place where you're going to live rather than like a nomadic lifestyle of hunting and gathering. So I definitely think you're right on that. I was going to mention that there are some scholars who think that Rig might actually be Odin because of the various things that Rig will end up doing, and that it was sort of forced. What do they call it? A retcon, like because of the Voluspa, that because they mentioned Heimdall's children, that Heimdall and Rig must be the same person. I am not scholarly enough to have like a strong opinion either way, but I do tend to think that if they have the comparison between Heimdall and Rig, like in the actual manuscript, which they seem to, I'm pretty happy just letting it be like that, and so the gods don't play true to their character in our eyes. Like, who knows what's going on, right? So I'm quite happy to have this be Heimdall, but just so you know, there is an argument out there that it could be Odin as well. And yes, so when we're looking at this, you're exactly right. It's sort of the progenitors of society. We're seeing the raw stuff that society is going to be made out of, and they call it the great grandmother and the great grandfather because this is where we come from. And really, I guess that's a pretty good foundation for us to continue. So shall I move on with the poem?
Let's go.
This will be stanzas 4 to 7. Back to the poem. Then Edda took a swollen loaf of bread, heavy and thick, stuffed with grains, and she put that and more in the middle of the table. There was soup in a bowl, and boiled calf meat was set on the table. That was the best of their delicacies. Rig rose from his seat and was ready for sleep. He knew how to give them good counsel. He lay down in bed between them, with the man and the woman on either side of him. He was there 3 nights in a row. Then he went walking in the middle of the road, and 9 months soon passed. Edda had a child. They splashed him with water, wrapped him in dark clothes, and named him Slave.
Okay, so a few details to get to here. First of all, naming your child Slave, isn't that interesting? But the meaning of the word slave here, that's the translation that Dr. Crawford has chosen, but the original word is thrall, or thrall, which we certainly have in our usage as well. Slave is probably the most well-known descendant of that term or relation to that term, but also something like a serf would make sense. Really, the name, I think, just implies the lower classness of this child and presumably his parents. Now, I'm just going to circle back around here. The food that they're talking about here, it's a description of the amount of wealth that these people have. And they have bread, they have soup, and they even have a bit of meat. That's not so bad. That's not really the level of like a slave that's in abject poverty sort of thing. And I don't think that's a contradiction. I do think that this says something like society in general does have resources. It does have agriculture. It does have enough food that even the lowest class of people have enough to eat. and they have some variety. Like, that's a decent variety in nutrition. Their bread being heavy and thick, stuffed with grains. I mean, that's them really just making sure to get as much nutrition as possible into as small of an item as they can, probably being at the same time frugal but also efficient with the resources that they have. And then making a soup, I mean, that's a good way to make something last longer, like meat, or I'm assuming they would have bones and things like that. And that's a good way to make sure that what you have available lasts a long time, quite a few meals. And so that just shows the level of wealth that I and Edda, great grandfather, great grandmother, have. And then here's what is interesting. Most interesting is that Rig sleeps between I and Edda. They make a baby. Reproduction. That's what that is. And it's an interesting implication. Of course, there is some implication here that Rig is the father of this child, and that would make sense as well with the reference in Voluspa with men being the children of Heimdall, if he is literally fathering these children. But maybe he's just facilitating. Maybe he's showing them what they need to do. I do think that the emphasis on the reproduction here, or at least the explicit discussion of sleep together 9 months, then there's a baby, it also speaks to the importance of especially people living under these conditions, as in they've got some agriculture and some animals and things like that, but life is still fairly difficult. There is an importance to reproducing. And there would have been a time when humanity really could have gone either way in terms of being, well, getting to the point where we are now with this flourishing civilization and essentially going extinct. There was a time where that would have been possible, where the human population could have been wiped out by a natural disaster or getting killed by predators, whatever. And every individual little tribe that would have been on the earth, tribes would have not necessarily been all that large either. 50, 100, 200 people would have been the network of people that you would have been able to be in contact with just by the limits of being able to travel X amount of distance reasonably. All these little tribes would have been at risk of like a single bad growing season just wiping them out and no longer surviving. So a key point is that everyone's got to be reproducing. Everyone's got to be making kids. And I mean, that's the reason for things like the taboo of homosexual relationships and things like that, because that wouldn't have resulted in producing children, right? That's the most charitable explanation for those sorts of taboos coming about, right? And of course, we don't need those social taboos now in terms of population is going to sustain itself, right? But back then, it would have been very clearly like everyone has got to participate in this, whether they like it or not, because this is the only way we're going to survive and make more people, right? So,
Oh, definitely. I mean, there have been a few things that have almost like made humans extinct. I'm just like the plague, for example, that wiped out a whole bunch of people, right? So, yeah, existence wasn't always assured, and yeah, reproduction was super important. It's a biological imperative for a reason, right? So, yeah, it was just. Plus, you needed people to like tend the farm and all that kind of stuff. So, yeah, it really shows that it was funny while you were talking. I was right at the beginning. I was worried you were going to leave it to me to explain the stuff with Rig in between the, and I was like, oh crap, because it's weird, right? Like you think about it, and it's kind of weird. I really liked your point about maybe he was showing them how. I hadn't thought of that, and then I started thinking like, you know, we learned about the birds and the bees. At least I did in school, like during health class. But how do humans find that out if they don't have health class, right? Like, do we instinctively know? I don't know. That, like, if someone smarter out there knows, like, definitely like let us know, because it's interesting to think like it's interesting to think that a species might not know how to procreate just like naturally. Because I mean, dogs and cats and like animals out there, they seem to know because there certainly aren't classes like teaching, bears how to procreate, right? So it's just interesting, like that. It would be very, to me, that makes a lot of sense. That you would have this figure of society kind of uh, teaching humans how to survive and make more humans. Because I went more the I guess like spiritual or like deity route, thinking that you've got a man and woman coming together, the masculine and feminine, and you've got the touch of a god in there because you're creating new life. And I just found out that like at the moment of conception, it actually gives off light, which is crazy. Like they had seen it in animals before, but they hadn't seen it in a human. And then they discovered it in humans as well. It's like, that's kind of weird. Like, and so having that like that weird actual like spark, I was like, okay, I can see how like there would be, if you're so inclined to believe, the touch of God or a god there kind of thing. And then they even get he was there 3 nights in a row, then went walking, in the middle of the road, and 9 months passed. And it's like, okay, they knew that about 9 months after this particular action, because there was, again, there was a time when they weren't really sure how babies were made. It just, you needed a man and a woman, they thought, but, and they would, they actually thought men were the creators, and they just sort of like put it into the woman, not understanding that, a woman has sort of the entirety of the other, like 50% of the stuff you need to make a baby. So it's interesting to see the wisdom that they did possess. And even though it wasn't a scientific knowledge, they still had sort of that understanding that, this is what happens after this. So like, I don't know, that's pretty cool. And yeah, talking about the food they were eating, it's definitely an indication of their wealth. The swollen loaf of bread, heavy and thick stuff with grains, like that to me shows that they weren't able to mill a lot of their grains. So they would have had their flour, which would have been milled, but then a lot of the grains are just sort of putting it in there to I was going to say beef it up, but it's bread. So like to make it heartier, right? And milling would take time, money. You'd have to have a mill, which you'd have to build. Like there's a whole bunch of obstacles there if you're not in the upper classes. So you've got like this very peasant bread. And it's funny because nowadays, like if you're well off, then you're buying the multigrain bread, right? Like you're getting the bread with the flax seed and the rye, but the rye kernels you can like actually see in the bread because they haven't been milled. Like it's just funny how that's worked out. And yeah, soup and boiled calf meat. I mean, boiled calf meat, when he says delicacy, like that's the right word for it, because you've killed an animal that hasn't fulfilled its potential. Like it's not producing milk yet. You're certainly not getting as much meat from it as you could have if you'd let it live for years longer. Like this is special. So they are definitely honoring him with this meal. This is like the best that they have. And I like, it actually does sound pretty good, like soup, meat, and this hearty bread. I mean, it sounds pretty good, but like at the time, that is definitely like a lower class meal, but like the top rung of lower class. So you can see that there's definitely one rules of hospitality going on here, but also they recognize that Rig is important, and they're willing to honor him with resources, which is huge. And then the reference, after Edda has a child and they splash him with water, we still do that. We see that in baptism, and it would show like they call like a naming ceremony where you'd sprinkle the water on the baby and give it a name. And they would do that after a certain amount of time to make sure the baby was going to survive. So basically, is it worth giving this baby a name rather than like it's around for a while and then it dies? And like literally, what good is that for them, right? So yeah, and then so we have slave at the beginning, and as we go on, we're going to see the different classes and strata of society. But I also want to keep in mind that I think there's a kind of like an archetypal or even like personal development aspect to this, that we can see that, we start off maybe as slaves and then develop and, see where we end up here. But yeah. Shall I move on?
Well, a couple of points here.
For sure.
First. So I do like your divine theory, the deity digging into the reproduction aspect, because that is a divine act, right? It's the creation of the child. Like one thing that Dr. Jordan Peterson has said is that any society that does not venerate the mother and child is going to die. That every society has to put that into mythology in order to really put on a pedestal the idea of reproduction as being sacred. And that's seen symbolically. The main example in Western civilization is, of course, the Madonna and the baby Jesus. But in this context, it would also put the divinity into the act of reproduction. And so this would be the equivalent of doing that, as far as I see it. So whether the god Rig is facilitating, or whether he is that divine essence which provides that other element, right, that is required to create a child. And I mean, that is on some level pretty darn magical, as far as it's not every time that there's an egg available and sperm is just around. There's not every time. And which one is going to win? Which one of the millions of swimmers is going to be the one to win, right? I mean, that's all really onto the level of just blind genetic environmental luck, essentially. And yeah, there is an aspect to divinity to that, whether it's on a symbolic level or on a literal level. Like, it's not at the point where you can just say, okay, here's this great egg, here's this great sperm, and they're going to create this awesome child. Like, science cannot do that. Even things like in vitro fertilization, it's like you have to have like a lot of eggs and then sperm material and stuff, and then it's completely not guaranteed that any of them are going to even fertilize. And then if they fertilize, they have to implant, and then it's all these things together. And people can spend tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands even of dollars of spending money to try and get in vitro fertilization to work if there's conditions with either the man or the woman that makes it hard to conceive normally. Yeah, like science can basically put the two things together, but it's like a lead a horse to water sort of thing. Like, you cannot necessarily make the horse drink. I don't know which is the horse and which is the whatever in that metaphor. But and then the other thing too here, just an aside about the calf, is that there wouldn't have been ethical implications about them using a calf anymore, like today with veal. It's not tortured baby cows like the South Park episode. So anyway, I just thought that was a funny aside. That's what I thought of with the calf. But the calf in this case, I'm sure would have lived just a pretty darn happy life for a calf right up until the moment of death. And so that's just lovely in the whole idyllic sense. The way things used to be back in the day would have been nice for those animals, just roaming free, grass-fed sort of thing. Very nice. But anyway, that was just the couple of other points I wanted to make, and I'm good to move on now if you are.
Well, because you mentioned the veneration of the mother and child, Um, it gave me a very depressing thought, but like, why would you venerate first? Why would you venerate the mother and child? One, you need to reproduce, but also, you need to train men to not leave when this thing is just like this baby is crying and annoying. Also, like after giving birth, the mother is kind of sort of out of commission for, let's say, wifely duties, right? So again, there's nothing for the man, like keeping him around other than, wanting to bond with his child and all that kind of stuff. But having that extra layer of like societal influence and kind of society, like enforcing monogamy, I think you actually see a lot more men like just being like, I am out of here. Like, I can't stand this. This is annoying. I'm not getting anything good out of this deal. I'm going to go somewhere else and then make babies with them, because like for men, the drive is just to make as many babies as possible. It's not like raising them. Who cares? Right. Like it's just about, it's just about getting as many descendants as possible. But and I'm not saying that the only reason men stick around is through societal norms. I'm just saying that this is reinforcing sort of that behavior in staying around, raising your children, supporting your wife, all that kind of stuff. In addition to, I mean, it is pretty incredible that you carry around like a living being inside you for, months and months and then give birth like that. That is actually worthy of veneration in and of itself. But, I think it helps men to, keep them corralled and behaving properly.
Yeah, and even today we do have some elements of society that still reinforce this. And I think one of the main ones would be, say, child support being a big thing that is supposed to keep men in their place. It's not necessarily their place being with their presumably wife and child, but these days that's not guaranteed, but with the mother and the child. The thing is, if the man leaves and isn't contributing support to the couple and to the child, he has to pay. And of course the reverse is true, but it's much more rare that it's the mother who leaves and you have a single dad and the mother has to pay child support. That's much more rare for a variety of reasons. But the thing about that is that there is a monetary disincentive to leaving that situation. And of course that happens more nowadays. And maybe there is some aspect of this veneration that has gone away that would be better to understand a little bit more. And the other thing that I wanted to mention here too is that the divinity even applies to a child whose name is slave. You know what I mean? Like a child with that name who is considered lowly, and we'll see some description of slave and what he gets up to. Every child is divine by that way of thinking, by that way of symbolism. And it has to be, because there has to be that value in every person. You've got to be able to fit everyone into society and have them contribute. And of course, there are some people who are unable to contribute too much, whether that's through any form of, whether it's a handicap or something like that, or physical disability, anything like that. There are, of course, people like that on the extremes, but maintaining the divinity is also what would even say like children who are physically disabled or end up being mentally disabled or anything like that, there's still a divinity there. Now, I do think historically, actually, that children who are physically disabled, that was generally like they would be left outside and they wouldn't be there the next day, sort of thing. But what the divinity of every child would mean is that every life is valuable and precious, and we certainly believe that in society these days. There's none of that putting a kid outside. That doesn't exist these days. That's illegal for very good reason. But the thing too is that it integrates everyone into society. Everyone has something to contribute, because especially back in these days, it would have been very hard for society to last without every single mouth to feed, contributing something to said feeding, development of food, security, safety, anything really, is that everyone has to contribute. And so every child has the potential to grow up and do something. Now, if the child is named slave, then that implies some things about what slave is going to be able to do in life. But still, even slave is divine by that measure, which I think is important. And so I think that just all of the reasons why Rig would be in between I and Edda, I think there's a lot of great reasons for that symbolically, which is why this poem is so cool.
Definitely, 'cause I definitely remember the first time I read this, and you get to the point where, Rig's in between them, and it's like, what is going on here? So yeah, shall I move on?
Let's go.
This will be stanzas 8 to 13. Back to the poem. Slave grew up and did well for himself. His hands had scabby skin, knobby knuckles, and fat fingers. His face was ugly, and he had a bad back, and a long pair of heels on his feet. Soon he got a chance to test his strength. He made rope, he made baskets. All day he carried firewood home. Then a woman came wandering his way, with scars on her feet and sunburnt arms. She had a hooked nose, and her name was Slave Woman. She sat down in the middle of the floor, and Slave sat down next to her. They spoke and they whispered, slave and slave woman. They ready to bed after a hard day's work. They had children. They taught them and loved them. I think their sons were named Lumpy and Barn Cleaner, Noisy and Horsefly, Sleeper, Stinker, Midget, Fat Boy, Slow and Gray Hair, Hunchback and Dangle Leg. They made fences, they planted fields, they raised pigs, they herded goats, they shoveled manure. Their daughters were Shorty and Fatty, Fat Calf and Beak Nose, Shriek and Slave Girl, Gossip, Skinny Hips and Bird Legs. All the families of slaves are descended from them.
Okay, so now we're into the meat of the implication of this poem, which is, so after the reproductive act of Rig and that being so interesting, here is now the result. And so we got to a little bit of how the meanings of the word slave, how those meanings might imply what slave would get up to. And now we see a description in fairly good detail, actually, for so few lines of what slave's life is actually going to be like. And well, he is doing manual labor. That is essentially his lot in life. He's got scabby skin, knobby knuckles, fat fingers. Like, that's someone who does manual labor. And I read something about how this would have been essentially a stereotype of how the lower class would have been at the time, because at the time of writing this down, this is most likely at the same rough period of time that a lot of the rest of the Poetic Edda would have been written down, the 11th, 12th century sort of thing. And this would have described essentially the stratification of Viking age society. And on the one hand, it's descriptive in a sort of stereotypical sort of way that the people who are more lower class are essentially a little more ugly. They do a lot of manual labor, bad back. The bad back is probably an effect of doing all this manual labor, but it could also be something genetic or an accident that happened or whatever, lots of different things. But life would have been hard for Slave. And yet he did well for himself, and he found a woman, he found a wife, he found Slave Woman, and you know what? They just sound like they are doing just fine together, having lots of kids. They're ready to bed after a hard day's work. That just kind of is like, aw. And then their children, the children's names, this even gets even more descriptive as far as their children. And their children are given names that imply that they are just going to be doing a whole bunch of the same stuff that their parents did. Making fences, planting fields, raising pigs, herding goats, shoveling manure. I mean, they are doing the work of an agricultural society. And this is good and necessary work, but these kids are not all that good looking. The girls especially are not necessarily given attractive sounding names. Interesting one, for example, being Skinny Hips. I mean, that one showing something like she is not nourished enough to have curves, sort of thing. But then you have Fat Calf and Fatty, and so I mean, they have names that maybe are slightly contradictory, but they all somewhat imply that they're not the beautiful ideal of women of that time. And okay, so this gets into a couple of things. The trick with this poem, I think, in terms of the original meaning, is whether it was descriptive or prescriptive. And it especially applies to the slave descendants. And of course, a reminder that slave, the original word would be thrall. And so it's not necessarily definitely that it's the same as our conception of slaves, not necessarily. I think it really just does imply lower class, what we would see as lower class, doing manual labor, sort of barely getting by, but making it, sort of thing. Now, the thing about this is that if this is descriptive, that the lower classes of people just sort of happen to all be kind of uglier, kind of not so good looking, and this is all that they're really going to do in life. That's possibly kind of accurate for the reason of, even today, it's harder for people in a lower social class to move up for the simple reason of life being difficult, life being hard. If you're in a state where all you're really concerned with is getting by and even getting the next meal, sort of thing, life is a lot harder. You have a lot more general stress. And a big thing here is that the amount of stress inhibits the production of serotonin, which is a hormone that, and I'm no expert on this, but that regulates essentially how you feel, how you are happy and confident. And it regulates position in essentially the dominance hierarchy, which is this ephemeral thing that everyone essentially magically knows where they stand. Whenever you enter a room or a social situation or anything like that, you know where you stand in that room compared to the other people. And it's almost just instinctive. Animals essentially have this as well, where they know where they stand in comparison to others. Even things like wolves or baboons or anything like that, there's the term alpha, and this would be like the alpha male would be the top male in these troops or tribes or bands or whatever you call them. And the alpha male isn't the alpha because he has gone and killed all the other men, because you need males. You need males in any society for various purposes. You know, for wolves, that would be like they got to go cooperatively hunt and things like that. And also they need to be there in order to help reproduce and things like that. But if the alpha male were to go kill every other male member of his society, well, there wouldn't be anything left and society would collapse. But they instinctively know which one is the top, the leader. And the leader is the one who gets to have the first pick of the spoils, the food sort of thing. And the alpha would be the strongest or the most capable. And we have that in our society as well, in terms of strength, social status, a whole bunch of other things. And that's how you just kind of instinctively know when you enter a room where you stand. And people in the social situation of slave and slave woman and all their children would, for the most part, because they have a hard life and there's not a lot of ways for them to get ahead, they also don't necessarily have the most nutritious food or the most access to resources that actually have a major impact on development. Like when societies get to have more nutritious food available, they grow taller, they grow stronger. And there is some evidence that societies with better nutrition even have higher IQs and things like that on average, which is just really important in terms of being able to advance in society. And these people essentially do not have that available. And so if this is descriptive of this lower class of society, it actually does make a lot of sense in terms of the idea that people in lower social class have a hard time breaking out of that because they don't have the ability to do anything other than all the things that are necessary for survival. There's no chance to move beyond that. So if it's descriptive, that's a good thing. If it's prescriptive, now that gets into a little bit of a tricky area, because if this poem was created for the purposes of saying, you are a slave, you're descended from slaves, this is your lot in life, just deal with it. Well, now that becomes problematic, because today, especially, we do have a lot of resources available for people to get ahead. And there is a much greater chance that someone born into poverty today is going to be out of poverty, and their children will be born out of poverty. That's a greater chance than any other time in history, just because of the way society is structured. But so in terms of implication for today, that would not be a good point of view to kind of take here. But if it's descriptive of you are born into this social situation, therefore it's going to be much harder for you to advance out of it, that is valid, I think, and makes sense, because it is harder. It is harder if you're born in a lower social situation, social economic status, genetics being a factor, environment being a factor, all of these things are kind of lined up against you, then that becomes harder. And certainly in the time when this poem was being written down, maybe it would have been something like almost a comforting sort of thing. Like, this is your social status. You can still get married and have children and live a hopefully decently happy life sort of thing, but this is your lot, right? And all the descendants of slave and slave girl do not sound like they're going to advance up the social hierarchy. And this is where Heimdall being involved with this in terms of boundaries also gets involved here, in terms of the stratification of society and some implication that the social stratification of society is natural. And what I would say to that is the social stratification of society is natural only on the level of it's descriptive of what actually exists. And it is the case that the people in lower classes do have a harder time getting out of that. And it turns into a feedback loop where genetics and environment can make it more difficult to do so. So the totality of this poem, we're really getting into it here with this description of slave women and their children.
Definitely. I take just a slightly different stance on it, because I think it is descriptive, but I do think there is some prescription there as well. Because like when I was reading it, slave grew up and did well for himself. Like, we would think of that as maybe moving up class, and that wouldn't have been available for the slave. So he did well for himself in that he did his job as a slave well. And he's got the scabby skin and knobby knuckles. When I was reading this, I did actually laugh out loud at some of the names. Like, I don't know why, but like bird legs and skinny hips and hunchback and dangle leg. Like, I thought that was it's just mean. Like, there's no real room for like a nice interpretation. Oh, like, look at that cute little hunchback. It's like, no, he's hunchback. And exactly because what you were saying, either the work, which actually what parents do physically can turn on and off certain genes. So that, like, that's definitely something that can contribute to sort of the genetics of their children. So that, like, there's definitely a reason why they would say that, you know, slaves are ugly and all this kind of stuff. And it's that when the genetic markers that would be turned on and off for it would probably lend itself to being not as attractive, and I'm doing air quotes, for people. But also there was a belief, and we actually still struggle with it, I would say, is that good-looking people are inherently good because it's sort of a reflection of their quality of character, and ugly people are bad because their ugliness is also a reflection of the character. And you can see this through many other civilizations as well. Like I know in Rome, when they were electing politicians, a lot of their like attack ads or whatever would be about how ugly this person was, and so obviously their soul was not good and could not be trusted with something so important. Can you imagine today if, sort of unofficially, we do make fun of politicians for being ugly, and I've often heard politics as being Hollywood for ugly people, but you don't often see like a politician, like two people going for the president of the United States, just coming out saying you're ugly, and you can't trust them because they're ugly. It does happen usually from various corners of the internet, but you're not going to see like an ad with the words I am Donald Trump and I approve this message, or I am Hillary Clinton and I approve this message. My opponent is ugly and you can't trust them. You're not going to see that. But you do sort of unofficially, you do see it on Twitter and whatever. So, and then the other thing too with slaves were thralls, and I'm not sure if they had this belief in Scandinavia and sort of the European area, but I do know in ancient Greece there was a belief, and Aristotle was a proponent of this, that slaves were at the bottom of the social hierarchy because they were slaves, and that if they had any self-respect, they would have happily died rather than being taken slave. So I wonder if we see a little bit of that here as well. Just they're going through all these, I'd say, negative situations or negative characteristics of a slave. And I wonder if it's because they also had that belief too that, well, there's a reason why you're a slave, and it's because the quality of your character is such that you allowed yourself to be taken as a thrall, as a slave. And what makes me think that is all the families of slaves are descended from them. So to me, it shows that there isn't a lot of movement up and down. So I think in this case, if you're a slave, you're kind of stuck there. But then also, if we look at it sort of from a more symbolic level, I think a lot of life is about overcoming, our slavery to things like needing to eat, and not you overcome it, you don't need to eat anymore, but you've sort of taken care of that. The basic things that you need to live are not really a concern for you anymore. You can focus on other things that aren't going to necessarily make you survive, because your survival is pretty much secure. So when I was reading this, I remember thinking that, okay, maybe there's something here where we're seeing also not only the development of society, because when the agricultural society first developed, this is pretty much like everyone. This isn't, sure, they had leaders, but there wasn't like a middle class. It was sort of like the leader of the community, and then everyone else just trying to scrape and survive. And then it would have stratified further. So, and one more thing about not moving between the classes, we still see that today, not so much in North America, because when we sort of split from Europe, the class system didn't seem to follow as much. But if you go to Britain, yes, the class system is officially gone. If you go, it's still there. There's no, it's it's still enforced on a societal level, even though it's not official. So, there's working class neighborhoods and middle class and upper class and all that kind of stuff. And it's still there and alive. And so you can see how that it hasn't changed that much, but also like how far into the future it's come. Like this is pretty stuck. And then like places like India with like an actual caste system, this stratification of society is actually pretty normal. Sort of wasn't like, I know in Canada, at least, if you do a survey of like what class do you live in, by far the majority of people like self-select for like middle class, and that's like everyone who I remember there was controversy around it because people who like to talk about class, they wanted like these very very easily defined classes of people, so I guess it would work better for their thesis or whatever. But when they did the survey, everyone was like, yeah, middle class. And that sort of ranged from like borderline like poverty to like, like very well off upper tax bracket kind of stuff, where they're like, yeah, middle class. So everyone kind of thought they were in the middle, and it's like, oh, okay, but like what's going on here? But there doesn't seem to be that class consciousness that you see in, I'm going to use the air quotes again, the old world.
Yeah, in a lot of ways, the way society has advanced has helped that, but it's helped it in ways that maybe aren't completely obvious. Like, for example, the conditions of poverty still certainly exists in the Western world, in the United States and Canada, but it's not the same thing as poverty in Africa or India or things like that. And so I would think a lot of people who maybe are still what you would call poverty line or whatnot may still see themselves as middle class, either because they used to be. That would be quite common if you used to be and then fall on hard times, sort of thing. Or you just see that the world around you, like you're getting by and you've got a lot of things taken care of, then yeah, that could contribute to the idea that, so I mean, you've got a roof over your head, you got food, things like that, and yeah, then you would self-select for middle class, and maybe that you define that as lower middle class. But, and I've got something to say about that whole system, but I'll get to it later. I will. But then on the upper class end, what's interesting is also that if you have someone who's making a lot of money, but they're spending quite a lot of money just to maintain the so-called middle class lifestyle, it certainly would be upper middle class at this section. And maybe instead of everyone's got one house, one car, two kids sort of thing, I think that's still a pretty good definition of regular middle class and regular things going on. But then maybe these are people who also have a summer cottage and an RV and a boat and 3 cars and things like that. But impressions on society, the veneration of the super wealthy and celebrities in Hollywood and things like that, there is a distinction between those people and I would say the rest of society. And I think it would take a pretty big leap to be able to even self-consciously say, okay, yeah, like we've broken out of middle class somehow. And I think there are actually class-based measures for that too, like such as getting into the country club or something like that. That would be a major way that you've made it, and you have to spend a lot of money to get into said country club and pay annually. Like the club that Donald Trump owns in Florida, like you have to spend like exorbitant amounts of money to get there to be allowed into that club at all. But then you are you're rubbing elbows with the president a lot of the time sometimes, right? So that's quite something, and that's a delineation. I think there's a clear delineation between upper class and middle class if you go by that measure of it. But then it gets murky when you're looking at lower class these days, because I don't think you can make an argument that the lower class doesn't exist anymore, even if people self-select to not be there. you definitely still have people who are getting by paycheck to paycheck and who are just barely making it. Now, you have people who are getting by paycheck to paycheck who are living in pretty good situations, living in very nice houses. But these are societal problems that are, I think, quite different from the societal problems and structures that would have been the case when agriculture was the key industry and really everyone had to be involved in that. But today, you would see people like if you're on food stamps in the US or welfare or whatever, any number of those things. I mean, yeah, that's the people who even need societal support to get by. And I would hope that people in those situations would understand that and self-select for that they are in lower class, but at least they have the aspiration of getting further, and we as a society are helping with that, which is why I mentioned previously, like it is significantly easier now to move out of a lower class situation into an upper class, middle class situation. You had to, it's unless you win the lottery, you had to go kind of through the ranks. And then even the other thing too is that if people win the lottery, but they were poor prior to winning the lottery, that money just kind of goes away pretty darn quickly because if you don't know frugality, if you don't know a lot of these things, it's very easy to just spend money and lose it. But and then in other parts of the world too, we are raising on a worldwide level people out of poverty, at least extreme poverty, at a huge rate, and people who would have just been like barely scraping by, literally, are now actually able to afford things that are would have been considered luxuries for them a long time ago, but that we take for granted here in the West, and so. Yeah, the world is going to be a better place in terms of human advancement and bringing people out of these situations. And so maybe back to the descriptive versus prescriptive thing. That's why I don't know if this is one or the other in this case, because even if they're saying things like all the families of slaves are descended from them, well, that could just be prescriptive of, in general, no one breaks out of that. You know what I mean? Like it would be just extremely, extremely rare. And the slave doing well for themselves would have been living a relatively fulfilled life and doing their work and producing children. That's successful in that situation. And things would have been a lot different there too, in terms of how they say that even slave and slave woman, great grandmother, great grandfather, they have food. They've got food. They've got food to eat. And of course, I think there would have been some aspect of if the whole village has a famine, it would have been the lower class people who would have lost out. There would have been less to go around for everyone. But yeah, they would have lost out in terms of that nutritional value sort of thing. But they are surviving. They're surviving, and that's the point. And in today's society, we maybe even have more trouble with that in terms of society getting together and actually supporting people who are in these social situations, as far as being able to get out of that and survive and actually afford food. We have things like food banks and charity and stuff, but I don't think there's as much emphasis on that as there used to be. And so maybe that's something that we as society can kind of look at in terms of, here, even people who are considered to be lower class, like, they got food, right? So that's something, and they're doing well for themselves and having children. And yeah, that's kind of reality here. But as far as it being just a description of how society was versus you're a slave, you're going to be a slave, just get over it and deal with it, I don't know if that's what they're saying. And so I'm willing to give it the benefit of the doubt and say that I think it's just descriptive of what would have gone on. But I also see the point of view if it's prescriptive, and therefore if it's prescriptive, then that becomes problematic for us in terms of how to deal with that. And maybe we have to say, well, this is something that we're not advocating bringing forward into modern society.
Oh, for sure. I mean, well, there's lots of stuff in here that we do not advocate for bringing forward in modern society. I think we've covered this. Shall we move on?
Let's do it.
All right, this will be stanzas 14 to 16. Back to the poem. Rig went on upon his way. He came to a hall. The door was open. He went inside. I'm reading the right. Yes, okay. I'll start that over. Rig went on upon his way. He came to a hall. and the door was open. He went inside. A fire burned on the floor. A couple sat there busy with their work. The man was busy with wood carving. His beard was trimmed. His hair lay in locks on his forehead. His shirt was tailored. He owned a chest of drawers. His wife sat and spun her spinning wheel with her arms. She was weaving. She had a headdress. She wore a blouse. She had a lace choker and jeweled brooches. Afi and Amma were their names.
Okay, so now we're getting into the phase of the poem where it's getting into the differences in social classes. So we have that whole bit about slave and that showing the way the lower class would have been, but now we're meeting the middle class. And Afi and Amma means grandfather and grandmother. So we had great-grandfather and great-grandmother. Now we have grandfather and grandmother. And before I get into that distinction, I will just say something like, I do think this implies progression in some sense, because like you mentioned previously, this would have been the way the lower class was, the description of that would have been everyone, or virtually everyone, in a society that is just barely making it and scraping by. But once society gets to have a little more wealth, well, now you start to see everyone doing just a little bit better. And of course, when this is being written down, you would have had the class of slaves or thralls or serfs or however you want to translate that. But you would have also had this middle class start to emerge because there are more resources, there is more wealth. But the distinguishing aspect here of Afi and Amma, grandfather and grandmother, is that they're both doing work, which is interesting. And I know why you got a little bit confused there with the reading in terms of they both have a fire burning on the floor, but the distinction in this one is that the couple is sitting there busy with their work. And so what we're looking at here is that they are indoors doing this. This isn't outside manual labor, just satisfied with producing agriculture. And that would have been something that society would have still needed, right? And so this is to say, the point of time with this being written down, all the classes of society would have existed and been necessary for that society to function the way it was. So these middle class, the man is busy wood carving. He's doing something that is a little bit less necessary in terms of the furthering of society. And the woman is spinning. The wife is spinning. We've talked a lot about spinning in previous episodes, but the first, just a basic aspect of this, is that she is weaving fate symbolically. So the meaning of this that I see is that the man has idle time in order to pursue hobbies, and the wife is actually able to pursue proactively affecting the fate of her household and her descendants. And this is what comes of not spending every waking moment just making sure you have enough to eat, right? And so this doesn't get into necessarily how this middle class developed. And so I think this actually adds a little bit to the prescriptive point of view on this poem, because this isn't necessarily pointing us to, okay, so we've got this lower class here. Here's how they went to become middle class. And now you've got the middle class. No, Rig has gone to a separate group of people who are now suddenly a bit better off. You know, trimmed beard, hair in locks. Like, they spend time on beauty and ornamentation, right? They spend time on work. They spend time on, not just manual work. They spend time on work that isn't completely necessary. They've got free time. So yeah, this just progression here of Rig going from the lower class to the middle class, it's interesting. And you're seeing in pretty good contrast the difference between their two situations.
Definitely. That's pretty much what I was going to say, is that you're seeing a couple here that are working on things that are still important, but not necessary. Like you can sew hides together for clothes, right? Like you can figure that out without having like a tailored shirt that you keep in a chest of drawers. You don't need those things. So we're definitely seeing like I would say like a major advancement. And I think part of it is too that perhaps because they have the slave class doing the basic necessities, now they have time for wood carving and making themselves look beautiful and spinning and weaving and all that kind of stuff that's nice. Like, it's still useful. A lot of these are still useful things, but they're not necessary. And that's kind of how you know when you're out of the lower class as well, is that now you've got free time. That I've heard the distinction between rich and wealthy is that rich, you've got a lot of money, but wealthy, you've got a lot of time. And like, I think that's a great measure, because time is one of those resources that you can't make more of, right? It's no matter what you're doing, you're spending it. So you have to figure out how to spend it best. And this isn't like a necessarily a bad way of doing it, like carving wood. I mean, if you're an accomplished wood carver, you can probably make a pretty nice house, right? Which makes it nicer to survive, makes life easier. And then having good clothes that are handmade, like, yeah, things are looking up for these people. Definitely.
Yeah, it really cues them up for the advancement in society. And that's why it's interesting. You have the great grandfather, great grandmother, then grandfather, grandmother. I think this is also describing some of the progression of society. It's not necessarily on that literal of a level, but it shows that an understanding that humanity would have all been concerned with just the basic necessities of life. And then in the future, they got enough surplus. This would have been how it would have had to have happened. There would be enough surplus in order for some of society to not have to be concerned with the basic necessities of everyone's life. Now you get into the aspect of, well, how is the slave and the free man determined, right? But the middle class, the lower class, and I just got ahead of ourselves just a little bit there. Maybe that's a sign we need to move on after this. But how that gets determined, I think we are going to see some of the other descriptions of what society is receiving from this middle class, because it's not just wood carving and spinning. There is going to be more, and we'll see that. I think we're at the right stage, but unless you had something else.
No, I think that's a perfect spot to move on. So this will be stanzas 17 to 23. Back to the poem. Rig knew how to give them good counsel. He rose from the table ready to sleep. He lay down in bed between them, with the man and the woman on either side of him. He was there 3 nights in a row, and 9 months soon passed. Emma had a child. They splashed him with water and named him Freeman. His mother wrapped her red-haired, ruddy child in cloth. His eyes were keen. He grew up and did well for himself. He tamed oxen. He made a plow. He built houses and he built barns. He made wagons and drove a plow. Then they brought him a housewife with her keys in goatskin clothes and married her to Freeman. She was named In-law. She wore the bridal veil. That couple lived together. They exchanged rings. They shared their sheets and made a home. They had children. They taught them and loved them. Their sons were manful and fighter, brave, swordsman and smith, stout, farmer, trimbeard, rancher and husband, sharpbeard and manly. And they had daughters with these names: smart, bride, swan, lady, dame, girl, noblewoman, wife, shy, and vivacious. All the families of free farmers are descended from them.
Okay, so we've seen the distinction here. The people in the freeman class, That's the translation that Dr. Crawford chose for this. The original word would have been Carl, which we sort of have as it's a name now, essentially, that has descended down through that. But freeman is a good translation as any, I think, as far as what it actually means, because these are people that are engaging in trades and crafts. And when they say farmer and rancher, for example, these would have been the people with the knowledge of how to organize and how to lead efforts as far as the farming goes. It would have been like, okay, people in the slave class, like, here's what to do to make this all work. The implication here in the difference is that these are the people with the knowledge and the people with the ability to essentially advance. And the name of the children, the names of the sons and daughters, the activities that Freeman gets up to, these are all things that essentially go into making a nicer society. And they actually are doing some of the things that we have in our cultural consciousness of what, say, the Viking people would have gotten up to, like the housewife holding keys, getting married, wearing bridal veil, exchanging rings. Those are all cultural constructions that we associate with the Viking age, the Norse people. But what it's implying here is that wouldn't have been accessible to the lower class. They wouldn't have had the resources or the wealth to be able to do all those things. And so this is the stage where culture is really developing. So at this stage of advancement, where at least there is this class of people that is able to do this, this is where culture really gets going and develops. And the thing here is you do need to have that surplus. You need to have a surplus of food, of resources, of landscape, whatever. All of these things have to be that you've got enough that you don't have to have everyone just involved with producing the agriculture, and you can have some of them do things like become swordsmen and smiths and farmers and ranchers, which would be growing the agricultural operation even further. And they even have some that I think imply having things like barbers, like someone who is associated with keeping beards trimmed and groomed and things like that. And so isn't that something? And the description of the daughters is also much nicer. They all seem to be, if not just generally positive, at least neutral in terms of their qualities. And so bottom line here is that there is some description of society advancing and how that has taken place. The names given to these children compared to the ones of the slave class, though, that's interesting. And if they're trying to describe what the middle class is like compared to the lower class, there's a few ways that this makes sense. And the main one is really just that you get into these positive feedback loops. There's almost got to be some kind of level where it switches from you got a positive feedback loop keeping you down to now you've got a positive feedback loop moving you forward. And that's what happens here. And that would result in better nutrition, which would result as well then in better genetics, essentially, because over time, these better markers are going to show up, as well as you're able to select a little bit better. You can be a little more choosy. People who get the better luck of the draw are able to pick mates that are a little bit better as far as luck of the draw goes. That's another reason for social stratification and dominance hierarchy, is that you essentially have the best possible mates picking each other. That's the desired goal. And even if you have a society where you have monogamy, it wouldn't have always been the case. You would have almost exclusively had the top male would have been the one to breed with just about everyone, which is why the top male status would have been very coveted, and still is to a degree. But in societies where monogamy is encouraged, you would basically have the top eligible male get picked by the top eligible female. They make a good match and off we go. And then you can sort of go down the list. And the middle class would have had much more opportunity because their children would have just naturally had a bit more available in terms of making their development more possible. And again, this gets into a little bit of the whole social, how do you organize society in order to give people the best chance of making this happen. And nutrition is one thing, and society, the environment to society, it's another. We've made it much better for people. And so while there is still certainly work to be done in terms of there's people kind of in a lower social situation and it can be hard to get out of that, we have made it more possible. Those things that would have been essentially a lot of people would have not had it within their control to make this work, because this is going to be an inconvenient distinction on some level, but a lot of the people in the lower class would have not had the physical and mental capabilities to move into the middle class. That just would have been the case. That even if you have a kid who is from a lower class background, the combination of nutrition, environment, and genetics probably would have made, unless this kid is exceptional, made it impossible for them to pick up a craft and to do it as well as some representative from the middle class of society. And so that's why in a lot of ways, classes, trades would have been passed down father to son. It's a positive feedback loop in terms of, first of all, they have the resources to get better and improve, and therefore the son is the one to learn and take that up. But it also would have been that the son of a tradesperson would have also been probably a pretty appropriate person to take up that trade afterwards. They would have had the aptitude and grown up near it and the environmental ability. So there just would not have been the opportunity for people of lower class to get up to middle class, because they just would not have had the traits necessary to get further in life. They wouldn't have been able to pick up a trade. Now, maybe you could argue that social opportunity wouldn't necessarily have been given. And that's where you get back into the prescriptive end of things. You have, okay, you're born into the middle class, therefore you're going to be middle class, and you're able to go and do that. Again, all the families of free farmers descended from them. And contrasting that with the lower class, like if you are lower class, you're going to stay there. Society would have still required people to just be involved with agriculture and doing manual labor. That's essentially reality. And we still even sort of have that situation. Like the reason we have cheap goods is that there are people producing it and not making very much money. Or agriculture, the reason agriculture is so cheap is that a lot of this stuff gets picked by people not making very much money. But we also at the same time would not argue that the people doing those jobs are just set up for a lot of that. Like that's going to be their destiny going forward. But it also does say that if you are growing up in that situation, it's pretty likely you're going to stay there too.
Mm-hmm. And just to be clear, we are not saying that people are genetically predetermined to their station in life at all. Just to be clear. There's a good movie, I think it was Gattaca, science fiction movie, I think, where people would be like genetically picked for jobs or something. I'll have to watch that again. But yeah, we're not saying that. We're just saying that lifestyle does affect genetics, and so if you're at this point in time, if you're in a certain class, chances are you're going to stay in that class for a few generations. There's a lot more movement between classes now. So just want to be clear on that before anyone starts calling us like, oh, you're saying genetics is how people should select jobs. Like, no, we're not saying that at all. One of the interesting things that we see in this is that law has now made its first appearance, and the housewife and the freeman are married, whereas before the great-grandmother and great-grandfather and grandfather and grandmother were not. There was no mention of them being married. That the law wasn't there to reinforce that relationship. And so it's interesting that I think the reason why is that with the slaves, they're already sort of under control, and because they can't just like pick up and leave, like they'll be punished for that, right? Or I guess they could pick up and leave, but you'd kind of say that they were escaping, right? Rather than moving. But here, when people are free, this is when you have law come in to make the boundaries and enforce them, because people are free to do what they want. And I mean, we're all free to do, generally we're free to do what we want in Western society. But there are like legal ramifications for a whole bunch of it. Like we are generally able to, attack someone walking down the street, but we don't, because like the law is there to provide consequences for that, and then hopefully protection for all of us, because who wants to be walking down the street and randomly attack? No one. But yeah, so it's neat that law has to come in here, and how much ritual they have around that. They're exchanging rings, they're sharing their sheets, wearing the bridal veil, all of that stuff. It's reinforcing the law in a societal and cultural way, so that it becomes the norm. It's not just here's the law and then live how you want and face consequences. It's here's the law, and because we think this is the best way to live, we're going to have these rituals that will really reinforce it and make it kind of make it feel special. Like there's a reason why you're going to be attached to this person in marriage, and with that your children will be legal and carry on your name, and why you're not just going to be able to pick up and leave when you want to, right? So it's neat to see that with the free man, the law has to come in to have some boundaries.
Yeah, it is interesting here where we get into a little bit of how society does advance. And once you have that surplus, figuring out how to organize society and actually do something with it, yeah, you do need buy-in, you need cooperation, and law is a great way to do that. And in fact, the law that we have today is based on some of these really old laws, the way society was structured. And here in the West, we are basically basing our laws off of Germanic cultures, the Anglo-Saxons being the seed for common law, English common law, which has really turned into the legal system in Canada. The United States is based on that too. And yeah, the way that society would have to advance then would be to see people specialize and get into trades and advance. And so that's why this poem is so tricky in terms of the overall meaning, because it almost seems to say something like, here is a way you can advance, but then it also makes the really clear delineations between the social classes. And so it makes it hard in terms of, well, maybe that's just showing that this is a tough reality you have to deal with, because you always are going to have people that are unable for various reasons to get that much further ahead. But thankfully, again, for us, we have done a pretty good job of enabling that. But then you also see how once you start to get a middle class going, that a middle class is actually very good at moving society along and getting it advanced and getting amenities and things and comforts in life that are just better. And of course, as you said, it is important to emphasize that genetics do not play a role in terms of your total fate. Like, that's not what we're saying based on this poem, but it is a description of how genetics and environment can all work together to make it harder for someone to advance and to move forward. And if this is going to be just a description of society in the time where it was written down, then you're definitely getting into how it would have been virtually impossible for someone to move forward versus right now, because moving forward in that time would have been harder to do because environment, genetics, and all that would have been against it. But maybe the implication becomes, once you break out of that, once a few people break out of that. Oh, and that's the other point I wanted to make, was that how is this chosen when society starts to advance? The inconvenient reality would have been the people who were most ingenious and most apt to taking on trades and challenges and figuring things out. Those would have been the people that would have moved out of the lower class into the middle class. And it's inconvenient because it does say that there would have been some aspect of genetics or environment or whatever to play, and it may have been relatively luck based. That's that divine element within the creation of a child, right? Like that really is how evolution works on a technical level, is that you basically create a whole bunch of kids in the next generation, and then the best ones are the ones that reproduce and move on. And well, that would have it would be the same sort of feedback in terms of how the middle class develops, because this doesn't really say anything about how exactly you get from lower class to middle class, but the read between the lines element of it is that it's the people who are able to take on those new challenges and start to develop cultural elements and law and trades that would have been able to break out of that lower class into the middle class. And of course, today we are organized differently. This is 11th century, 12th century Iceland, Scandinavia. We are organized differently. So what this poem says about the organization of society at that time is not the same as where we are now, but it does have some good insight on how culture would have developed at that time.
Oh, for sure. It's that's one of the for me, it's one of the neatest things about this poem is that we have this snapshot of how society was organized that, like, it's one of the best snapshots that we have for virtually any society of that time. And that's one of the things that makes this such a valuable poem. It's just because it's so, like, historical and actually historical. We don't have to, like, Rig didn't, we don't necessarily have historical records of Rig going around impregnating people, but the way it's set up, like that's amazing that we actually have this to be able to sort of put everything in context. Shall I move on?
Let's do it.
So this will be stanzas 24 to 30. Back to the poem. Rig went on upon his way. He came to a hall with the door facing south and standing open. There was a ring for knocking on the door. He went in and found the floor covered with straw. A husband and wife sat there and looked in one another's eyes. They were named father and mother. They held one another's hands. The husband sat and strung his bow. He bent its shaft and made arrows for it. His wife inspected the sleeves of her blouse, stroked the wrinkles out, smoothed them out. She adjusted her headdress. She had a jewel on her chest, a long dress, and a blue-collared blouse. Her face was more beautiful. Her breast was more beautiful. Her neck was more beautiful than pure snow. Rig knew how to give them good counsel. He sat down between them, with the man and the woman on either side of him. Then Mother brought out a fine white ornamental cloth and covered the table. She brought out thin sliced bread made of white wheat and filled the table. She set out full plates and treasures of silverware on the table, loaded with meat and poultry. They drank wine. From gemstone beakers, they drank and talked till the day turned to night.
Okay, we've advanced one more time. Father and mother, that's actually literally the words that are used here for these names. We don't need a translation. It's father and mother is what they are. So they appear to be rich now, upper class. This is an extensive description by comparison of their lives and the fact that they are just doing things that are not even all that useful as middle class. Like the husband is stringing his bow. The wife is inspecting the sleeves of her blouse. Like she's not spinning anymore. The man is not woodworking. They are essentially at idle. They have so much wealth now that they don't need to worry themselves with even having a trade to engage in. And this is an interesting aspect of how society would have been structured and who would have been developing this poem at the time. And I think the idea would have been would have been somebody in the middle class creating this poem, because the description of the upper class is very extravagant and also shows that there is a kind of an idleness to the upper class, and that can be the view of them, that they're not necessarily adding as much to society, but they are the most beautiful. And that's another interesting thing here too, is that the stratification, the implication that the most beautiful people are the ones who deserve the wealth. And for the most part, we follow that rule in society, that we give beautiful people nice things and money, and that just seems to be what happens. And I will clarify that is just the way it can appear anyway. I'm not going to say that a lot of people who are beautiful people don't have to work hard to get what they have, but a lot of them also just end up becoming famous actors and actresses. A lot of them are probably sorted from just being the best looking, are the ones that make it to the top, even if they're excellent actors who have worked very hard. And that points to a little bit of, again, the genetic unfairness in terms of, if you win the genetic lottery, life is going to be a lot easier for you. And the upper class, that's what this would show here. And they've got a lot of stuff too. They've got basically ornamental things for everything. They've got plenty of food, loads of food, full plates, treasures, silverware on the table. They drink from nice goblets all night. Like, they don't have a care in the world. And that's what I think everyone aspires to get to. And I think the implication here with going from, again, great-grandmother, great-grandfather at the beginning, grandfather and grandmother, then father and mother, is that this would have been the last stage of development. You would have eventually had people who just have enough stuff that they barely have to care about just about anything. Now, we are going to get into another phase of this that is going to show this a little bit differently, how the role of the upper class is a little bit different and the concerns of the upper class are a little bit different, because no matter who you are, life needs to have some meaning. But these people have a lot of free time on their hands, and that at least is the description here in this few stanzas.
Absolutely. One of the biggest indicators of their free time is that they've got time to look into each other's eyes and be all romantic and all that kind of stuff and hold each other's hands. Like, they have time for courtship. And honestly, it sounds like they've got time to pick their mate rather than have their mate picked for them for various reasons, like, combining the wealth of two families or whatever. Like, I'm sure that happened, but there seems to be a bit more choice here. One of the things I liked, talking about, her face, her breast, and her neck, more beautiful than pure snow. Like, what that says to me is that they actually didn't have to go outside and toil in the fields. They weren't tanned. They could maintain their alabaster skin. And I know for a long time, like, very white, almost translucent skin was a sign of royalty and beauty. And that's where we actually get the term blue blood from, because you'd actually be able to see, like, the blood in the veins of these people, because they weren't out toiling. They were inside, protected from the elements, right? They didn't have, their skin wasn't weathered and, tough from all the things outside that, make your skin leathery and hard to, and I don't know if they would have had ointments at this time, but they would have, but if they did, this is the class of people who would have been able to use it, right? They could take care of, like, beauty would be a great concern for them, rather than the things that lead up to being able to take care of beauty, and ornamental cloth and thin sliced bread, made of white wheat. Like, that means it's been milled a lot. Like, so we went from that very grainy bread that had been milled a bit, but really, like, they were just throwing grains in as filler, partially because, like, we can't digest, like, full grains, right? Like, it's just not what humans are designed to do. We have to mill it and break it down. And so they've got like this really nice bread, treasures of silverware loaded with meat and poultry. They're drinking wine, like that's highfalutin stuff, that they would have had to like tend to grapes and all this kind of stuff. Like they're definitely living the high life. And they're talking till day turned to night. So like they've got the energy to sit around and talk rather than, get up at the crack of dawn, do a hard day's labor, and then go to bed as it gets dark, because one, you're exhausted, and two, you can't see, so you're going to bed. Like this, you can see too, like in comparison, a lot of people in this day and age live more like this level, at least in the West, than some of the other levels. Like, yes, there's concern about putting food on the table and that kind of stuff, but even with that, we're still living like high class Vikings, I guess. And then to your point about beautiful people getting money and stuff like that, I remember there used to be a show on I guess it was Much Music, which was like MTV. So back in the day, MTV used to show music videos, and Much Music was the Canadian equivalent of that. And there was a show called Pop-Up Video that would give little facts about a certain song that they were showing the video for. And I remember it was for a Tom Petty song, and I'm not sure which one. It might have been Don't Come Around Here No More. And the music video, if I'm remembering this correctly, is sort of an Alice in Wonderland theme. And during the video, they've got like a close-up on Tom Petty's face, and they're talking about a study that was done that shows that beautiful people are more successful more quickly than ugly people. And I'll put that in air quotes as well. And so they're talking like it took Madonna like a certain amount of time to break big, right, and become an international superstar. And then they take someone else, another star who is like wildly, like insanely beautiful, and took her even less time to become a star. And then they're like, yeah, it took like Tom Petty like 10 years to work through the clubs and all that kind of stuff. And you're just like, oh, poor Tom. But it's a measurable thing that we can see that, yes, that beautiful people do have it easier. So unfortunately, at least for myself, that means we've got more work to do. I don't know about you, Luke. You're pretty beautiful.
Oh, thank you, Dan. I was going to say the opposite, but the reverse. But no, the funny thing about that there, the way this is all organized too, is that this isn't necessarily that society just is giving beautiful people nice things just because. It is also that beauty is an ideal. There's even aesthetics and all the Renaissance art and things like that. That was the obsession, was essentially the ideal people. And the thing about it is that humanity selects for, like on a broad level, selects for characteristics that you can see, which imply success outside of that. And beauty broadly implies that other things are also working pretty good. And it's one of those characteristics that you can just see. And so beautiful or handsome people are those that have a higher likelihood of essentially being better genetic mates. And this is sort of a chicken and egg sort of thing, but I think it applies here regardless, that I think the traits that are considered beautiful would have been those ones that also coincided with other traits being good in health and genetics and all that. And so the people who are most likely to survive and be the most successful and be the people who are able to get through the social hierarchy the best, the fastest, would have also been beautiful people. So it's a positive feedback loop. It's a self-selection that turns into, well, the most beautiful, most attractive, most capable people are also the most competent in terms of, I mixed that up. The most beautiful people are the most competent in general on average, because it's just that self-selection thing. The people who are most able to rise up to an upper class are the ones who are most beautiful. Now, that can go completely sideways when you start to get into these super rich families that start to go with the purity of the blood, like the Habsburgs being an example, where basically everyone was married to their cousin. And I believe even the lines of ancient Egyptians were really, really bad for this, in terms of, like, you'll see King Tutankhamun being a common one, where he married his sister, and his mother was like his I don't know, his parents were married, like were siblings, something like that. I don't want to pull incorrect things out, but it was like, yeah, he was the product of considerable inbreeding, and he was not healthy. And yeah, so ideas that keeping a bloodline pure through just keeping all these good people together, that's also not going to work, because then it's going to amplify negative characteristics that create really bad health outcomes. But it's the idea that the most beautiful people are also the most competent and the most worthy of admiration. So on one level, you get society just gives beautiful people nice things because they are representative of the ideal. But then it also becomes maybe a lot of attractive people are also just very smart and savvy and competent and able to rise up the hierarchy. So it's kind of coming at it from both sides. And this is me trying to sort of say, we're not necessarily totally garbage people just for venerating nice looking people, and society necessarily has to get rid of this, because the ideal, first of all, is something to strive for, but the ideal also venerates people who are not just beautiful on their own, but also competent and able to do something with it. And all of these dynasties that would have gotten to the upper class, well, they would have eventually just completely collapsed because they tried to maintain it the wrong way and weren't competent with their wealth and their power and whatever. And all the, like, the dynasties of Egypt, you go through them and they change dynasties like every couple of generations at some levels, because it was just like, yeah, now that family's done because they had a lot of inbreeding, and got to try it again with a new family, sort of thing. But yeah, it's all just to say that the whole beautiful people thing, there's some reasons for it. It's not just shallowness. It's shallowness because those are the visible characteristics, but the implication is supposed to be that underneath that these are actually the most competent people, and it's a positive feedback loop again as well.
Yeah, this isn't we're definitely not saying if you're ugly you have no hope, because I have hope. And I mean, hey, if Tom Petty can do it and he was awesome, like, who doesn't love his music? So, good stuff does come out eventually. It just helps if it's wrapped in a beautiful package. I know where we're from, it's not a super well-known name, but a woman named Trisha Helfer. She's an actress. Stunningly beautiful actress, best known for Battlestar Galactica, I think. She was noticed riding like a tractor in rural Alberta. There's actually a surprising amount of films done in Alberta, and like a talent agent was going to a set and drove by and noticed her and stopped and like signed her up, kind of thing, because she is that, like, stop in your tracks, gorgeous. So it turns out she's actually a pretty good actress, and like on Battlestar Galactica she's awesome. But he didn't know that at the time. He just saw, like, beautiful woman, like, I can make money off this. And then it turned out she was actually, good at pretending to be other people. So yeah, it just, what's that saying? I wish I'd been born rich rather than good looking, or something like that. No, good looking rather than rich. I'm not rich.
They both make sense. I mean,
yeah.
But well, yeah, that just gets to end of the day. The unfairness in terms of the genetic lottery, that is kind of a real thing. And the stratification of society here, it really does play that out. Like, they are showing the ugly people at the bottom, middle is in the middle, and the most beautiful is at the top. And Whether society is structuring itself like that intentionally, I can't say, but I do believe there is some aspect of self-selection, natural selection to it, where that would have made it the case. And then the definition of beauty would also change. Societies have different definitions of beauty, and it it tends to be that the definition of what the upper class most is, that's the definition of beauty, essentially. And those are just the traits that have come together to get to the people who are in the upper class. So it's kind of, it's a life is unfair sort of thing, but it also shows where society kind of has come, because it would have been hard to go from lower class all the way to upper class. And now it is actually possible to do that. It's rare, but it's not impossible, which it broadly would have been here based on these descriptions.
For sure. Shall we move on?
Let's do it.
This will be stanzas 31 to 33. Back to the poem. Rig knew how to give them good counsel. He rose from his seat and prepared the bed. He was there 3 nights in a row. Then he went walking again in the middle of the road, and 9 months soon passed. Mother had a child. She swaddled him in silk. They sprinkled water over him. They named him Lord. His hair was blonde. His cheeks were bright. His eyes were as cruel and clear as vipers. They raised Lord there in their home. He learned how to hold a shield, to string a bow, to bend a bow, to carve an arrow, to throw a spear, to cast a javelin, to ride a horse, to hunt with dogs, to draw a sword, and to swim competitively.
Okay, here we have Lord. And the original word for this is Jarl, which, if you're familiar with Vikings, they got Jarl, and that's the same word as Earl. So these are just all different words for Lord. So good translation there again. And the thing about Lord is, well, first of all, blonde hair, bright cheeks, the eyes. The eyes element is actually interesting because the eyes were said to have been keen in the freeman sense, but now he's cruel and clear as vipers. I think they are making some way of describing that he is supposed to be even more intelligent. I think they are trying to say that, like, this is the mark of someone who is just that rung above. And then the things that Lord does, he's doing all these things that are associated with aiming and hunting. And this is a symbolic metaphor for basically the hero, the person who's able to go out and actually hit the target and do things that are requiring skill and tricky. He's learning martial arts. And Lord just seems to be on a completely different level as everyone beyond him, and certainly he's enabled by his upper class status to be able to do it. And again, it just gets into that whole positive feedback loop. Once you're there, once you're in the upper class situation, maybe it is just significantly easier to spend time staying there, because Lord seems like he'd be a pretty formidable opponent if you were to try and take anything from him.
Well, he's got all this time to practice, right? He doesn't have to worry about getting food. His shelter's taken care of. Someone else is making all of these items for him. So he gets to play with them and use them. And he gets training, which is huge. And I think that's also why, like, yeah, his eyes were as cruel and clear as vipers. There's, I'm actually like, that's impressive because vipers are like apex predators, right? Like there's not much that eats them. They might not be apex, but they're certainly near the top of the like feeding hierarchy, because they're so dangerous, because they've got venom. Like even birds aren't going to mess with them too much because they are that dangerous. And he's getting this stuff like, yeah, he's a formidable person. He's going to be able to impose his will on the world around him rather than have the world impose its will on him. And that, I think that's a good distinction to see, is that the other people are reacting to the world and sort of dealing with it on the world's terms. But at this point, he's not only able to deal with the world on his terms, he's able to practice it. And that's huge.
Yeah, and I don't have much more to say in this sense. I think we are going to move on here relatively shortly, but the only thing I'll add to that here is that it shows that where we are in society, like loads of people have so much free time, whether it's just to play video games or watch TV or what have you, but it's also plenty of time to also practice skills and get better at things. And well, the Lord here, Jarl, is doing things to better himself, and that's what's going to keep him in this situation. But shall we see where he goes?
Oh, I think so. This will be stanzas 34 to 40. Back to the poem. Then Rig came walking to their farm. He taught Lord runes, gave him his own name, called him his son, told him to claim lands, to conquer lands, conquer old villages. He rode then through the icy mountains of Mirkwood till he came to a hall, and shook his spear, shook his shield, set his horse to a gallop, and drew his sword. He started a war. He reddened the fields with blood. He killed many men. He conquered lands. He became sole owner of 18 estates. He shared his wealth. He gave his men treasures upon treasures and good horses. He gave away rings. He did not care to hoard them. Then messengers came along well-prepared roads. They came to the hall where that chieftain lived. They presented the beautiful, soft-fingered, wise girl whose name was Eagle. They offered Lord the girl, took her to his home, married her to him. She wore the bridal veil. Then they lived and loved one another. They increased their family and enjoyed their days. Their oldest son was boy, and the next was kid, then offspring and noble, heir and scion, descendant and successor, son and lad. Another was nobility, and the youngest was named king. They played together. They learned to swim and play chess. The sons of Lord grew up there. They broke horses. They made shields. They shot arrows. They made war.
Okay, well, things have taken a turn for the epic because Lord is going off and doing all of these awesome things now. And the implications for this, so first of all, what he's doing is he is using the things he is trained up to do to basically exercise power in the world. And I don't think this is getting into the morality necessarily of going and starting a war. In fact, I think if anything, this would have just been everyday life, the way life works. And societies as a whole would have eventually tried to structure themselves to reduce war, but at a lot of times it would have been essentially necessary because there would have been a lot of young men who would have been unable to really find a good mate, and war would have been a better thing than it is now in terms of society's ability to structure resources. This would have been brought on by scarcity in a lot of cases. Like you go out and you conquer lands in order to better secure the safety of your people. And then look at all the treasures he gets. This does say a few things about the responsibility of leadership at the time. It would have been seen as a responsibility that the Lord shared his wealth, that the Jarl would share his wealth. He gave away rings, did not care to hoard them. Like he presented treasures, things that have no intrinsic value other than to show and illustrate wealth to his society, right? The assumption would have been to the free men of the society or the people with him, right? And so it's a case of making society better by the people at the top going out and bringing more wealth to their society. So it does show the role of the upper class. There is a role for the upper class to be able to do that. The other side of it, and this was essentially seen in the show Vikings and in sagas, whatever other stories, where it's like if the leader does not share the wealth and become the responsible leader, well, then he's going to be deposed by someone else. And we even see this all the way down to the level of chimpanzees. Like if you have a chimp who does not maintain social relationships, he can't enforce that on his own. And 2 or 3 lower rank chimps could just go tear him apart and kill him, right? And then you're not a leader of the chimps anymore, you're dead. And it would have been the same thing here. Like even on the upper class, the top of the dominance hierarchy, you've got responsibilities, and that's what Lord has. But then he goes and eventually gets a bride, and the implication is that she is like a top quality bride, soft fingers, like she's not doing any manual work. And then they have a whole bunch of children, and their names are really cool in terms of like the idea that they're inheriting this legacy, but the last one's name is King. And I've heard this be that the name is either Kong the Younger, because Unger is like younger, but it also could be Konungur, which is king. So whichever way you slice it, it's like either King the Younger or just straight king, because Kong is like the Norwegian word for king, which would have been a shortening of Konungur sort of thing. So it's like, yeah, the entire situation is just that they have king. So you're going from lower class to middle class to upper class to king. And we're going to end off with what happens to king. But the sons of Lord, they grow up and they do all the things that their father does. And again, it just shows if you get to the upper class, your children also get to have that result. And so if it's a description of society, yeah, it's pretty good to be descended from Lord.
Yes, Lord seems to be the entry point to like life's pretty good. One of the greatest compliments a Lord could be given was that he hated wealth, because he'd be giving it away. So that's a major thing that they're showing here, that to be a good Lord, you have to give it away, and you don't hoard it. I think if the Sopranos is accurate, the way they would talk about it is, the head of the family doesn't eat alone. And that's exactly what we see here, is that he's making sure that his men are taken care of. And your point about the chimps was right on. I mean, if you've got one chimp who doesn't take part in society, then and is sort of a tyrant, he's going to get killed very quickly. And then we see that with actual tyrants in the world. Like, there isn't really a good retirement plan for tyrants. It's usually like being killed, and usually being killed in like a terrible, terrible way, like dragged through the street or tortured or what have you, because you've done that to the people and they're getting their revenge. But
we got video evidence of that recently, Muammar Gaddafi.
Well, that's actually who I was thinking of, but that's exactly it, right? Like, and I know in the 80s, the leader of Romania, like communist Romania, Nicolae Ceausescu or something, like, I think on like Christmas morning, him and his wife were just torn apart. Like, whoa.
The Russian emperor, like it goes all the way back.
It's not hard to like pick off names of people who, Mussolini, and actually one of Mussolini's descendants, someone posted a picture of like Mussolini and I guess his wife like hanging and being beaten or something, and I guess they said that it's they had nothing to do with it, but to be associated with that, it kind of sucks, because like you didn't have anything to do with it, but you're sort of being lumped in the same pile as it. So it was that was, as of recording this, it was just a few weeks ago when that was published. I don't remember where, but yeah, like, so within like 5 minutes, we've easily rhymed off a whole bunch of tyrants who were killed in a not nice way. So don't be a tyrant, really, is the lesson here. And that's what we're seeing here, is how not to be one and how you should behave. Shall we move on?
Let's do it.
So this will be the last section. It stanzas 41 to 46. Back to the poem. But young king learned runes, runes of fate and runes of destiny. He learned spells to save lives and dull blades, to calm storms. He learned the language of birds. He learned to put out fires, to calm sorrows and induce sleep, and give comfort in sorrow. He had the strength, the passion of 8 men. Rig shared runes with him, but King tricked him and learned them better than he. And then he earned the right to call himself by the name of Rig for his rune lore. Young King rode with his arrows. He shot arrows. He killed birds. Then a crow said to him, a crow sitting on a high branch, "Why do you kill birds, young king? It would be better to mount up on your horse and kill men." I know 2 chieftains with rich halls. They live nearby. They have bigger inheritances than you have. They know how to steer ships. They know how to sharpen blades. They know how to kill men.
I love the way this ends. And apparently it's maybe speculated that this is an unfinished poem. We don't quite have the end of it, but you know what? It ends perfectly. I love it. So, okay, let's step back here a little bit. King is learning the runes. And if you remember our Havamal Part 6, the episode where it's mostly on the runes and Odin's sacrifice to win the runes, like that is some important stuff. That is like the deepest knowledge of the universe. And the implication here is that King is even better than his father, Lord, in terms of his ability to just see the way the world works and manipulate it to his advantage. And in fact, he learns the runes better than Rig. And I haven't found an exactly correct translation of Rig, but I know what we were discussing before we started here was that Rig comes from essentially the same root word as king, and it's the same, even in Irish, the form is the same Rig. And it comes all the way back from the same etymological lineage as the words we have for empire, like the word realm comes from the same place. The German word Reich comes from the same place. Raj in the Indian languages, it's the same word. Rex, the Latin word rex, which was the original word for king, ruler, it would have come from the same root. So Rig is a big deal. Rig, if it comes from that particular origin, is a big deal. And if King gets to also call himself Rig, well, apparently he's even further in terms of the ideal and in terms of being the ruler. And then I guess the idea here becomes that there is, no matter what status you are, there's always some challenge beyond. And I think the implication here, because Lord was considered to be a chieftain or conquered chieftains, well, then someone who of equal or even better status as young king, they exist elsewhere as well, who are similar in size and wealth as his father, as he is currently. And the implication, I think, is that he's going to go conquer them and become the king, like the actual king. It's not just going to be his name. He is going to have earned that title. And the thing about it, it just shows that there is always something to achieve. No matter where you are, no matter how high status you are, there's always something to achieve. There's always something to set your aim to. The crow is right. He's saying, why are you killing birds? Like, he should have his eye on the real prize, which is other powerful men. And yeah, the story for King, I'm sure, is going to turn into some great adventures. And that really is the final form, I think, of what you aim for. Like, who doesn't want to be king? Who doesn't want to be absolute top of the dominance hierarchy? And on that note, I think that's why this poem is exactly right, because you go from the bottom to the top. And what I like for this in terms of what it shows is, if you're trying to find out what myth you're living, you can see right here in terms of where do you see yourself out of this hierarchy, and then you can see some of the ways beyond it. And I think in today's society, we make it just completely possible to go and to set your eye on a goal and to reach for it. And you know what? Maybe you'll get to the top.
I think you're exactly right. it's so not only is it this historical description of how society was constructed, but it's also this almost like esoteric description of the levels of how you develop yourself and eventually become a king. And like one of the things I love is that, king surpasses his father lord. And I would guess that most fathers want their children to surpass them and be smarter and healthier and stronger than they were. Like it all just works well. And then if you're going to go through self development and self improvement, the better person that you become is sort of, the young king, and the person that you've become better than is the father, right? Like the person you are now is sort of the father or mother of the better person you're going to become. So it's a really neat it's a really neat poem because of its historical explanation of society, and that it has this interesting path woven on how to improve yourself. And it's neat that young king himself becomes Rig. He becomes he's gotten to a level where he's kind of he's going to change society itself, and that he is going to be the one who procreates with all of these other classes for something new, right? Like he's the one that brings in sort of the new era. So it's just really amazing to see Rig's journey, and then young king becoming Rig himself. And then his next step is, I know two chieftains that he's got to go. Well, there is always something there is always the next mission to go to and accomplish. So yeah, it's just amazing to end with this.
Well, yeah, and it ties it all together too, right? Because where do you go if you surpass a god, right? And that's the absolute top you can make it to. And then bringing it all the way back around, and like you said, as far as Rig is the one who influences society top to bottom, right? Rig was involved in the creation of all of this, but now this young king is the one who gets to be Rig. And that just shows if you make it to the top, you can influence society the way you want to. And if that's not a top level goal, I don't know what is.
Well, no, that's exactly, that is the top of the hierarchy, is that you influence sort of the rest of the hierarchy and become what they're aiming for. So yeah, it's just it's an amazing study in like social hierarchy and dominance hierarchies. Yeah, so I don't really have too much more to say about it other than how awesome it is, and that it gives you this path. That one of the things that we didn't mention, actually, that I wanted to bring up, was all through it when Rig is traveling from couple to couple, he's walking in the middle of the road. And I think that shows he's not taking, well, he's balancing between the masculine and the feminine, the order and the chaos. He's taking that middle path. He's straddling both. So it also shows you how you do that. You have to be able to take both sides in and work with it. Just as he was doing, I'm going to assume, with, in the marital bed.
Yeah, it's interesting. So many different cultures have this middle way sort of thing as the way of balancing all these things and being able to, because it's a balancing act. And if you go too far to one extreme or the other, yeah, I like that point. And I think the only thing I'll say in terms of any kind of recap on this is that this maybe exposes some difficult truths in terms of the way society is ordered and the reasons for society being ordered, the implications of it. They do actually tap into a lot of reasons behind why people might seem to be stuck within the social class that they're born into because genetics, environment, all those things have a role to play. But then it also takes us to this roadmap, and the progression through the generations is what makes me think this is actually supposed to be a poem to show the potential of self-development. And I've heard a lot of, maybe it's criticism, but maybe it's also just description of the American dream as being one of those things where it's like everyone has the hope of making it big and making it through the social structure and going from lower class to upper class. And you know what? That's valuable. If this story is in the same vein, I think that's very, very useful to have, because it says, here is what you have to follow in order to get there. Now, it does intersperse a lot of things that say, okay, well, there's a genetic component to that, but maybe they are being realist in terms of the way society would have been. Because if someone is from the lower class and they do not have the mental aptitude, the physical attributes necessary to go and to do the things that the middle class, upper class, and the king have to be able to do, well, you don't select the king based on just being born from the previous king. And I'm doing something here. I know that's the way society worked, kind of on a hereditary level. Like you would get it for hereditary reasons. But if the next king isn't as good as the previous king, and that continues, well, then you have a reason to get thrown over. And who's going to throw over a bad king? The best possible person who can be a good king. That's the most likely person anyway. I know this doesn't work that way in the real world, but the top of the dominance hierarchy is not the person who just goes in and by nature of birth gets it. The top of the real dominance hierarchy is the person who most deserves it. And maybe there's a huge amount of luck there. And maybe you have to have the right environment and the right genetics to make that happen. But there's also an element of you've got to practice, you've got to be competent, and you've got to work at it. And then you can get to the next level. And so this poem showed all of those all of those things. And yeah, at the end of the day, I think this can have some things that are maybe tough to see and tough to read, but it also gives you a goal. And so no matter who you are, you can look at this goal and say, here are the ways that I can better myself, and maybe one day I'll become king.
Absolutely. It kind of makes me think of like Olympic athletes, actually, because they've done studies where they actually Olympic athletes, not so shocking, actually have different genetics than us mere mortals. And for a lot of us, that lack of that genetic switch that's turned on for Olympic athletes, like we could just never reach that level of greatness in that particular activity. It just wouldn't happen. And it's also why like Olympic athletes and a lot of athletes at high levels aren't just good at their particular sport. They're generally good at all of the sports, and they just have one that they've specialized in. It's actually quite annoying.
It is, but they also have to work incredibly hard. That's the thing, is that the genetics only go so far. You have to work incredibly hard. So I think that's the combo here. That is what this poem is saying, I think, is the combo of those two things, because Lord and King, they had to learn, they have to practice. And so you win the genetic lottery, but if LeBron James never practiced basketball, he would not be the top basketball player in the world. And just he'd still be an insane freak of nature in terms of just his genetic makeup and all that. But I mean, he spends loads of time and money on maintaining his body, though, because he knows that's what that's what makes the money for him, and that's what makes him so great. And so it's not just the time put in, it's the combination of those things. And unfortunately, even if you like basketball, like if you spend thousands of hours shooting a basketball through a hoop and getting really good at that, well, maybe you don't, you're never going to be LeBron James unless you're LeBron James. But maybe you become Steph Curry if you practice for a long time. I know this is a very specific basketball reference if you're not into it, but Steph Curry is like the greatest basketball shooter of all time, and he spent the time in the practice, and he is a fantastic player as well, done very well in his particular dominance hierarchy, almost exclusively through practice. Also had a dad who played in the NBA though, so again, winning the genetic lottery, it's also a thing. So I think moral of the story is a little bit of, well, you might not be able to rise all the way to the top unless you've won some genetic lottery, which is maybe a little disheartening, but it does provide the roadmap of where you can get a little bit further.
Absolutely. And with that, I think we're done with the list of Rig, or the tale of Rig, or Rígsþula. So with that, we'll do our normal housekeeping at the end. The first people that we'd like to acknowledge, of course, is Grimfrost, our favorite source of Norse and Viking products. They've got all sorts of things like drinking horns, and drinking horns of every size that you could possibly want. You know, the personal size, the size where you're hanging out with friends, but then like the size that I don't even know what animal it came from, but you know, it's the one that you just fill up once and you're good for the weekend. Like you're not going to need a refill on that. Then awesome t-shirts like what we're displaying today. If you're on YouTube and you can see it, I'm wearing a Thor's mask t-shirt from Grimfrost, and Luke's wearing a Loki's mask. They've also have like awesome statues of gods, like I was mentioning before. It's an awesome company. They aim to build a bridge between the past and the present, and bring relevant parts of the Old Norse culture into our world today, which is what we're doing, and that's why we're so happy to be working with them, and they're such a good fit. And having their sponsorship is one of the coolest things that we could possibly have. It's just, we're sort of over the moon happy about it. They're in Sweden. They ship worldwide, and you should go check out their website, grimfrost.com. They've got, basically, if you're looking for something, they're going to have it. It's fantastic. Also, the music that you hear in our intro and outro is provided by a band on their label. I'm going to mess up the name, so Luke, I might let you.
Yes, it's Talk by Folka Bortafur Nordavinnen, and the album is Sagnamader.
So definitely check that out. It's like amazing folk music. Just if you like Wardruna or Tyr, like, or even like, I mean, Amon Amarth is quite engaged with Grimfrost. So if you're into that kind of stuff, like, you'll definitely enjoy this music. So definitely pick up that album. If you're looking to get in touch with us, we've got all sorts of social media, which you'll be able to find in the description below. And if you want to support us, the best way is through Patreon. And we use Patreon to improve our show just through technology and like software, that kind of thing, better microphones one day, a fancy mixer, that kind of stuff. Who knows, maybe even one day take the show on the road, go on some sort of like, you know, Northern Myths Viking raid tour throughout the world. You know, we can dream. We're always aiming for that next goal, right? Just like the young king. We also have an Amazon affiliate store, and we've got recommended books and music, and anything that you purchase through that link, we'll definitely see a bit of that. It doesn't add anything to the price to it. It's just that we get a percentage of the purchase. I'm trying to think of other ways you can support us. Oh, big one is subscribing on YouTube, leaving 5-star reviews on iTunes, and any other podcast service that you happen to use. That's a big way to support us. Sharing links, all of that is great for getting us in front of more people and expanding our audience, which, I don't know, if I do say so myself, we're doing something good here, and the more people who hear it, the better. And then we, of course, have to thank Jackson Crawford and Hackett Publishing for letting us use the Poetic Edda. As you just heard, it's a great translation. And you can get, now it's available in audiobook format, so you can hear Dr. Crawford read it to you as a bedtime story if you so wish. And with that, Luke, am I forgetting anything?
Well, Dan, there's one thing, and it's the most important thing, and it's for all of us to go find the myth that we're living.